There we go. Now we have sound. Hello, friends. I hope you can hear me all right. I'm seeing people in the chat already. Hello, everybody in the chat. It's good to see you. Let's see how long the lag is between when I start talking with no mic on and then people can't hear me and then they go, hey, your mic's not on. Hello, everybody. It's good to see you. Let's see. All right, we've got people in the chat. We've got Mandy, we've got Sam, we've got Julia, we've got Nikki, we've got Jonathan, Justin, Micah Melody, Adrian, Ellis, Jude. Oh, yay! Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're all here. Nice. And I'm just and there's Sydney. Yay! I'm just noticing that YouTube changed some things up from last time I streamed from 2 weeks ago. So hopefully things are running smoothly. Hello. Welcome to my, look at my nice shirt. I know that some of you have this shirt. I know I saw Sydney wearing it last week. This is a great shirt from a really awesome fundraiser for a friend in ministry who needs to get a service dog, and now he has his service dog. So good news all the way around. People get cool shirts. People get the service puppies that they need. Good times. Well, hello everybody, and happy Monday night. We are talking about an awesome short story from the Gospel of Mark tonight. And so I'm excited to talk about that with you. I suspect, I said this in the Discord, I suspect that people are going to have some thoughts and feelings about Jesus in this particular text. And so we might get into a big discussion about whether or not Jesus ever made mistakes. So I'm looking forward to that. This is going to be a fun story to talk about. It's a short one, like I said. Let me put up our verses for the day. Uh-oh. Can't see that very well on the wall. Here, I'll just keep my arm here the whole time. That doesn't help. I'm white. There we go. Now you can see it. We're looking at a short story. It's only, 6 verses? And so it's a short one. And so that means that we get to do a lot of digging into it, a lot of not just, there are some texts that I really want to, really dig into, the meaning of individual words. We're not going to do that as much with this text. I'm hoping what we can do with this text is that we can kind of get in and think about the actual, what do I want? The sort of repercussions or the way that we think about how this can affect our day-to-day lives. That's where I want to go with this. Uh-oh, did I put the wrong thing in the description for the video? I might have, because we are reading Matthew 15, not Mark 15. Did I put Mark 15 in the description? I probably did. Well, what's on the screen here now is correct, Matthew 15, and I will have to change the description for the video if it says Mark. But it's Matthew 15 that we're looking at tonight. There is a version of this story with this particular woman in the Gospel of Mark as well. As with many times in the Synoptic Gospels, we have a similar story told in multiple places. So there is one in Mark, but we are going to be looking at Matthew's version of this story, not Mark's version. So let me... I don't think it's going to let me change the description of the video while I'm doing this, so I'll have to change that after the fact. But what's on the screen right now, Matthew 15, is correct, so that's what we're going to be looking at. Thank you. Micah Melody says the Mark version is Mark 7. So we can definitely look at that if people are interested in looking at the differences and similarities between the passages. But we're looking at Matthew 15. Oh, Julia says, I said Mark in the beginning. Well, that's just a slip of the tongue. My bad. Matthew's what we're looking at. So this is the story of the woman who is often called the Cyrophoenesian woman or the Canaanite woman. And we read about her in this bit in Matthew, and then, as Micah said, in Mark 7 as well. This version, the Matthew version, I feel like it's more filled out. There's a little bit more that's said in this verse between the different characters, and so that's the one that I picked for tonight. But if y'all are interested in looking at the similarities between the two, I'm totally down to do that as well. So let's get ourselves set in the text here. If you've got a Bible near you, you want to turn it to Matthew chapter 15, go down a little bit to verse 21 is where we're going to start. So get set up there. As per usual, I'm going to be reading out of the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, for the text tonight. If you are reading out of a different text and you find something that is like different and like you're kind of confused about why the certain word is different because it seems meaningful, put it in the chat, because we always love to know when there are weird translation differences that we can kind of go, I wonder why they did that. So let us know. Otherwise, I'm going to start us reading here, and I'm going to actually as well put the link in the chat so people have it. So 21 to 28 is what we're looking at here. Oops, use an equal sign. There we go. All right, I'm going to put this in the chat as well so people have it if they need a link. Dun, da, da, da. And we'll get started reading. So I'm just going to, like I said, this is a short bit of text here. So I'm going to read through the whole thing, and then we're going to sit down and talk about it, dissect it a little bit. So background to this text, you'll see in verse 21, it starts off with, Jesus left that place. And you're like, what place? So if you want, you can back up just a tiny bit to the previous verse. What was going on in chapter 15 in general is that Jesus is kind of getting in arguments with people where he is living and moving around at the time. So right before this story, Jesus is getting kind of in arguments with people about what's clean and what's not clean. So he's talking about like the dietary laws and other sort of clean and unclean laws that were part of not just like the belief system of Jesus's Jewish siblings and family members, it was also part of the entire life that you lived, right? So it was a big deal. So he's getting in fights with people about that. And after that, like when he's in and near Jerusalem around that time. And so he gets in arguments with people, and then he leaves that place. So when it says Jesus left that place in verse 21, that's sort of around the area of Jerusalem is what we think is being talked about there. So, I just saw Sydney's comment. Yes, getting in arguments as one does when one is the Christ. So, starting in verse 21, here's how the story goes. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So, it's just a tiny story, but we're going to talk a lot about it because there's actually, as with most Bible stories and most biblical texts in general, there's a lot sort of underneath the immediate thing that you're looking at. So, the first question I have for y'all, and if you were at Bible study last week, at Bible study last week, I did a lot of talking about Deborah and Jael and a whole host of folks. Last week, I did a lot of talking. So this week, I'm going to do a lot more question asking. So get your fingers ready to type, because there's going to be a lot of questions, and I want a lot of feedback this week. So first question for y'all is, does this story with Jesus and this Canaanite or Cyrophoenesian woman, does this remind you of any other stories in the Bible? Specifically, any other stories about like things that Jesus does or people that Jesus talks to? Because there are some other stories that are similar to this one, and even some Old Testament stories that are a little bit similar. So I'm wondering if this brings up anything for anybody about stories that this one reminds them of. And, of course, as Jude is doing here in the chat right now, if you have translational things, stick them in the chat as well, and we'll talk about those. So while you all are thinking about what other stories this story reminds you of, I want to look at what Jude says here. Then she came and worshipped him. I wonder, Jude, if that's an appended verse or which verse that is that you're referencing. So I'm going to turn to my King James Version and see if I can find out where you're looking at that. Let's see. I see. Then she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. That's the difference. And in the NRSV, it says she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. So I see. That's the difference that you're pointing out to us there. Yeah, interesting. I wonder... I wonder. I'm going to look this up really quickly. That's, like you said, verse 25. And I'm going to look up what it says in the Greek and see if we can get any clarification on why that difference is. Matthew 15:27. No, not 27. 20. Hold on. 25. My bad. Let's see. So... I see. Okay, so the Greek word that is used there, oh, this is going to be a tough one because Greek is not my favorite. Prosekinai. Close enough. That word is translated in several places, looks like it's used in several places in Matthew, and it's been translated as worshipped, bowed down, knelt down. So all of those things have been used as translations for what she does there. So it looks like in the NRSV version I'm reading, it's translating it as knelt down, and the King James is translating it as worshipped. So really it looks like it's a question about, is this a physical posture that she's taking, like kneeling, that means something, and they're taking worshiping as what it means? Interesting. I don't know enough about that particular Greek word to know what that says, but I'm really interested that you brought that up, so thank you for doing that. Okay, it looks like we've got some similar stories that people are reminded of. Ellis says, I think of the woman who touched Jesus' cloak because she was also bold enough to demand healing from Jesus, regardless of his willingness to act for them. Yeah, so that's definitely a similarity with this story. They're both women who come and they ask Jesus for exactly what they want and need, and Jesus is a little bit like, there's like a moment of tension between him and both women in both of those stories, so I can definitely see that. Carolyn says, the first similar story that comes to mind for me is the Centurion with the sick servant. Yes, so actually, as I was reading through my stack of Bibles here and looking at the comments, the notes in my Bibles, they reference that Centurion's servant passage quite a bit, because they note that the centurion was also not Jewish, right? And this Canaanite woman, this Cyrophoenesian woman, she's also not Jewish. So both of them are stories where Jesus interacts with somebody who is of a different, like, cultural group than him, and both times he sort of has a conversation with them and then heals a person from a distance. So those are all things that line up similarly in those two stories. Julia says it reminds her of the story of the woman caught in adultery, the woman that Jesus saves from stoning. Yeah, I can see that. Jesus interacts with women in very interesting ways, and I can definitely see some similarities there. Sam says, I'm blanking on the where, but it reminds me of the centurion who asked Jesus to come cure his slave. Yep, and does it without having to go to him directly. Yes, so Sam, yep. Oh, good. I'm glad. Yes, that bit about the centurion and the centurion's servant and what kind of relationship that was, fascinating stuff. That we actually did a Bible study on that quite a while ago now. After we're done here, I will try to remember to put it in the comments of this video once I can find it again. Oh yeah, Sydney went back to the translation thing and says sounds similar to prostration. Yeah, so prostrating yourself was actually another synonym for that particular Greek word, which is to basically like lay down flat on the ground, more or less. So yeah, it's interesting that that Greek word, like some translations are translating it as the physical action, and then other translations like the King James are translating it as what they think that physical action meant. Just interesting translation differences. Jude says, it kind of reminds me of the story where the folks came through the ceiling asking for their friend to be healed, like because of the vague surprise. Yeah, I love that. This idea, that's another one where Jesus is like that story that we talked about, that story a few, gosh, it must have been like 2 months ago now, of the story of the man being let down through the ceiling. And in that story, it was like the people were kind of the problem in terms of getting to Jesus. There was such a crowd, they couldn't get to Jesus, so they just come through the roof. In this story, it's like Jesus appears to be the problem. But both stories are about people trying to get through these barriers to get to Jesus and to the healing, right? So Julia says, I don't think Jesus ever changed his mind or has tension. Yes, Julia, hold on to that, because that is going to be sort of the nugget of one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. So hold on to that thought, because I want you to bring it back up. Yeah, so Ella says the Centurion story that we talked about earlier is in Matthew 8. So if Matthew is telling it chronologically, the Jesus of Matthew 15 has already healed a Gentile. Yes. Okay, so that's where I want to put in just a tiny bit of thoughts about who this woman was. So this woman is, so the Centurion, theoretically, he's somebody who works for the Roman government, right? He's a Roman soldier. We're not really told about what his ethnicity is, but he's sort of like first and foremost seen as a Roman citizen, right? With this Cyrophoenesian woman, this Canaanite woman, it's important to remember that the Canaanites were not just some random other group that lived near the Jews at that time. The Canaanites were specifically they were two things, and this is what makes it difficult to think about, I think, for me. They were two things. The Canaanites were, one, the original inhabitants of this land. They were the native people who lived in this land before, the Israelites came from Egypt and then settled Israel, right? So the Canaanites were the original inhabitants here. And God said back in, Joshua and Judges, and Deuteronomy as well, that God was going to essentially, didn't like the Canaanites, and so God was going to clear the Canaanites out so the Jewish people could settle there. So the Canaanites are like the original inhabitants of this particular part of the world, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that because the Canaanites were this sort of original inhabitant group, and then the Jews came in and started settling stuff there, the Jews and the Canaanites are like sort of really old enemies. They're a little bit arch nemesis-like stuff going on there. And so it's important to know that this isn't just Jesus. Jesus interacts with other people as well throughout the Gospels. Roman folks, Samaritans, right? That's another sort of people group in that area. He interacts with other people that are not the Jewish people that live in that area. But interacting specifically with a Canaanite person is there seems to be more at stake there, because the relationship is so many centuries and centuries old. There's so much bad blood between those two groups. That even if Matthew is trying to tell this chronologically and Jesus has healed a non-Jewish person before, it seems like it's almost a different thing because this woman is a Canaanite and because of all that bad blood. Now here's one other thing that came up when I was reading for this text, and that is the fascinating point that Matthew is one of the two Gospels where Jesus' genealogy is given at the beginning of the book, or near the beginning, where it says, and so-and-so was son of so-and-so, and so-and-so was son of so-and-so. You have this big genealogy. And in Matthew's genealogy, you get included several women who are important to sort of the stories that lead to the arrival of Jesus. One of those women is Rahab. Now, Rahab, we haven't talked about her, I don't believe, in a Bible study before, but she was a Canaanite woman who helped the Jews when they were moving into that area and saved some people from being killed, saved some Jewish people from being killed. So she's seen as this heroic figure, but she was a Canaanite. And she's one of Jesus's ancestors. So I had never thought about that before when I read this particular story of Jesus having this trouble with this Canaanite woman, that one of Jesus's ancestors was a famous Canaanite woman. I'd never connected those dots before. So just a weird Bible thing for you all if you are interested in weird Bible things like that. So, all that to say, Ellis, oh my gosh, hold on. Got a tickle in my throat. All that to say, Ellis, that it feels like even though this woman is a Gentile and Jesus is main problem he seems to have is that she's not Jewish. There's like this sense that it's maybe about more than just that, you know, because of the fact that this is a Canaanite woman. Ellis also says, so it sounds like Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience with a particular goal of including Gentiles in the gospel, which could be why he gives more time to this story than Mark does. Agreed. I suspect that you are probably right. Lots of sort of scholars and commentary writers think of this as being an integral story to the sort of early Christian communities in pointing towards the sort of grafting on of Gentiles into the Christian faith. Like, they point to this story as important in that sort of lineage of story tradition. Amory says, there are some scholars who think that the ancient Hebrews were originally Canaanites. Yeah, so there are some really interesting connections in terms of language between the Hebrew and Israelite people and then the Canaanites. And there's also a lot of, like, for folks that want to get into like the archaeology of this, there is a lot of, it seems to be one of those cases where two groups of people insist that they are separate and different groups of people, even though they've been living together for so long that the only differences that exist are just like cultural differences, and they're not necessarily two groups of people anymore except for immediate practice. So that's sort of the archaeological side of things. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Amory. So looking back at the story again, and kind of having this information in our minds about like this Canaanite woman and a little bit more about who she was, I want to bring up what Jesus says to her when, like, you know, we're going to kind of go out of order here in terms of the verses, but I want to just look for a second at what Jesus says to the woman and what Jesus says about dogs, right? In verse 26, he says, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs," right? That sort of, like, what Jesus is doing there is referencing the woman. He's using this sort of allegory and calling this woman, you know, a dog, essentially, which was not a good thing to be. It was seen as sort of a... Some people think it was a slur that was specific to certain people groups, and other scholars say, no, it's not specific to, like, Canaanites. It was a slur used against anybody to call somebody a dog. And so Jesus is like he's using this, he's telling a story with what he's saying. He's saying, like, he's not just calling her, hey, you dog, right? But, like, the implication there is using this word that is a slur. There's some sort of some pastors, like I've heard people preach on this story before, who have looked at the Greek word when Jesus calls her a dog, and have looked at that Greek word and have noticed that it's a diminutive word, by which I mean like maybe it would be closer to puppy than dog, right? Diminutive, like in Spanish, adding ito to the end of something is a diminutive, right? To make it like little and cute. And they try to use that as an argument as to why what Jesus is saying is not as offensive. But to be honest, I don't really find it any different if you call somebody a puppy versus a dog, if you're using it in this sort of negative scenario and with that cultural understanding. So that argument doesn't like hold a lot of water for me, but maybe it's something to know, and that might be helpful. So I'm wondering what you all think of Jesus's reaction to this woman, right? First, in verse 23, it says, "But he did not answer her at all." And then when she does come and he does answer her, he says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And then he says it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. So I'm wondering what you make of Jesus's sort of reaction to her. Do you think Jesus is reacting to her because he has some particular prejudices? Do you think it's something he's saying on account of the disciples who are standing there? Do you think it's something that was sort of written for the benefit of other Christians who would read this story later, and that maybe Jesus didn't actually say something like that? What do you think is going on here? Why does Jesus say this? So Julia's wondering about the word that Jesus has used for her, and no, it doesn't have anything to do with sex or sex work or anything like that. It wasn't even a specifically female thing. To call somebody a dog was just a general bad thing to call somebody. Yeah, Mandy, so perito, not pero. Yeah. I know, it doesn't really help when you think about it. The fact that it's a diminutive makes it almost worse in my mind. So Sam says, could it be that he's playing his own devil's advocate, saying and acting like what his disciples would expect to vocalize their thoughts or feelings and then turn it on its head? Yeah, so Sam, that is a really common understanding of this text, that maybe what Jesus is doing here isn't necessarily because he feels this way about this particular Canaanite woman, but because he knows his disciples are watching, right? He knows his disciples are watching, and he knows the animosity between these two groups of people. So maybe he's playing along with it to sort of teach them a lesson. So that's definitely one traditional interpretation of this text. Oh, what is the word that he calls her in Greek? I'm going to have to look it up because I can't remember, because I am not as much a Greek guy as I am a Hebrew guy. So verse 26, hold on. Let me look. And then I'll try to pronounce it poorly for you. Okay, so the Greek word specifically, like the root of it, for little dog is kunarion. Kunarion. And so the sort of the way that he uses it, yeah, is very specifically a small dog, little dog, puppy, all those kinds of things. Kainarion. There we go. That's my best pronunciation. I know, Jude, it doesn't seem to be helpful to me either. However, they probably wouldn't have had, like, the hard thing about you thinking about that word is that our contexts are so different that it's hard to even know for sure what the implications of using that word would be. But I kind of agree with you. Mandy says, it's a good way to view it. A lot of times he wants to see our reactions and hearts. Yeah, so I think, that idea that, like, if Jesus is doing this so that he can provide a model for people, that's definitely a way of reading this, that he suspects what we're already going to think and then tries to sort of twist it a little bit. Ellis says, it's easier to read if I think that Jesus knows the woman's heart and that she will insist anyway and decides to use it as a teachable moment. Yeah, Ellis, I agree. I think one of the hardest things about this text is reading it from the perspective of the Canaanite woman, right? Reading it from her perspective and thinking like she's trying to, like, she believes this person has the power to heal her daughter, her kid, right? And to have Jesus respond so negatively to her, that's heartbreaking, right? And so I agree with you that it's a lot easier to think about this story if we believe that Jesus already kind of knew what was going to happen and that Jesus knew that she would keep insisting. Yeah, so that's another traditional interpretation of this text is that Jesus was sort of testing the woman, was sort of like seeing if he pushed her away, would she insist on the healing, right? And we do see things like that, right, in other stories where Jesus seems to ask people to really insist on what they want before he gives it to them. That does trouble me, and I don't know how to make sense of that, though. So yeah, it's a tough one, but it's definitely a traditional interpretation. Oh yeah, Julia said that as well. Jesus was also testing her faith. Yeah, so if that is the case, if it is the case that Jesus is saying, like, I'm just going to keep pushing this woman away, the sort of like, the sort of fairy tale thing about, like, you have to knock on the door 3 times before I'll answer it. If that's what's going on, then I have to believe that Jesus knew that she wouldn't walk away. Because if there was even a chance that she was going to walk away from this and not get the healing for her kid, that makes Jesus kind of an asshole. So I agree with you, Ellis, that it's easier to understand it that way. And more power to you, if that makes sense. Carolyn says, oh, I missed what Micah said. Maybe I should switch to a Hebrew focus to Greek. Austin, yeah. Micah, if you can take all the Greek, you can take all the Greek and I'll take all the Hebrew, and I'm fine splitting it that way. Carolyn said, maybe I missed this, but was the daughter present? I was just imagining Jesus scolding someone in front of their kid. Oh, yeah, no, we're not told in the text whether she's present. And it doesn't seem like she is because, well, I don't know. It seems like, I was going to say, it seems like that would be mentioned if she was there, but if you have ever heard a sermon preached on the story of Jesus welcoming the little children, you know that children were not really seen as full people in this particular society, and so she wouldn't be mentioned if she was there. So it's possible that she was there. I think the reason that I assume that she wasn't is because of that connection with the centurion's servant. So like in the story of the centurion's servant, right, it's the same thing where Jesus heals from a distance, and that's the way that most of the commentaries I've read have taken this story, as if the daughter is not there. So that's what I would go with, but it doesn't say specifically. Yeah, Sydney's responding to that. Yep. Oh yeah, and Sydney said, similar to the centurion. See, y'all know, you don't need me. You're just all talking, you're giving each other the answers. Yes, and Ellis points out that in Mark, it's clear that the daughter isn't there. So that's another good connection there. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, you don't need me. You'll have the answers on this already. Okay. This is something that I find interesting about this particular text, and that is that this whole conversation between Jesus and the woman is happening apparently on the border of these two places. Because I didn't notice this. This is one of those things where one particular word changes a whole meaning for something. In verse 21, it says, Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting. And it's not clear whether she came out of a house or whether she's coming out to this borderland where Jesus is showing up. Because right after this particular story, Jesus goes right back to the sort of Jewish boundary to where he'd lived before. So this is a weird moment where Jesus sort of comes out to a boundary, has this conversation with this woman, and then goes back again. And that wasn't something that I had thought about before. The fact that this whole thing is happening you can almost imagine it happening over a fence or something. That these two groups of people are, there's something that is separating them. And this woman is specifically asking Jesus for something that requires a boundary crossing. And so it's a weird thing where it's she's specifically asking him to jump over the fence. And Jesus is not sure at first, and then decides that this is going to be a point where that happens. And then he retreats again. And so it's just weird. There's a weird boundary crossing, in a good way, a knocking down of walls in a good way that's going on here. Ellis says, why was Jesus even in Tyre and Sidon if he didn't intend to minister to the Canaanites? Yeah, so there's a couple different arguments for that. One argument is that Jesus was one argument is that there was a specific faction of Jewish people that lived in that area. But I haven't seen a lot of actual evidence for that. It does seem like it was pretty well segregated from what I've read. Another argument is, like I said in the beginning, that Jesus is he's so upset the people around Jerusalem that he has to get out of town for a minute to let everybody cool down. That seems to be the most prominent interpretation that I've read, that he had to get out of an area because things were too hot for him there for a little while because he'd been making trouble. And so he had to move out of that area and then came back after things had settled down a little bit. The other thing about this particular area, Tyre and Sidon, is that Jesus talks about it. Jesus mentions it earlier in Matthew as a place. He says, he's saying woe to you, all these cities. And one of them, he says, woe to you, Tyre and Sidon. And he's woeing them because they have a lot of wealth and they're not sharing it with the poor people. So Tyre and Sidon seems to be a somewhat wealthy area. So that's something else maybe to keep in mind. Okay, Julia's bringing us back to this thing about, was Jesus unsure? Did Jesus make a mistake? So I want to sit and talk about it for a minute. I would like to know whether or not you think Jesus had a change of heart or a change of mind in this story. Julia has said that she doesn't think that's what's going on here. So Julia, I would be interested to know how you understand this story and like how you understand whether or not Jesus has had a changed mind. And so from other folks as well, like has Jesus changed his mind about whether or not this is going to be for all people, whether or not the Gentiles are going to be allowed to have the scraps or not? So I want to know what people think about that. Did Jesus change his mind, or was this the plan all along? What do you think? I'm going to have a drink of water while y'all talk it out. Another weird note, not really something to discuss in full, but a weird note here. It's weird that this Canaanite woman, who is not Jewish, calls Jesus son of David. That's relevant to Jewish folks, not to Canaanite folks. Why does she call Jesus son of David? I don't know. Some people have pointed to the idea that perhaps that should be a clue to us that this was written by Matthew or by the Matthean school at a later date to Christian communities or to Jewish communities. And that was supposed to be a clue that that would have been what they would have known Jesus, and therefore the Canaanite woman sees Jesus this way as well, which is why she has the faith she does to get the healing. So there's a whole argument about whether that bit, son of David, was written in for later audiences so that they would go, this woman knows what she's about, even though she's from the wrong side of the tracks. So just a weird thing there. So Sam says, I don't know, I feel like not giving him that wiggle room, Jesus, the wiggle room, would not recognize the part of him that was fully human. Sam, I want to talk about that more in a second, but I want to read what other folks have said. Sydney says, historically, Tyre through the entire classical and mid-Roman period was central trade hub of the Eastern Mediterranean, basically the next major trade port northeast of Alexandria. Oh, Sydney, thank you for that historical context. Sam says, maybe the God part knew it'd work out fine, but the human part was, but do I have to? Sam, I want to hold that for a second. Julia says, Jesus is God and knows everything, including how this woman reacts. He uses this as a teaching or testing moment. Okay, that makes sense, Julia. Thank you for explaining. Sydney says, I think she may call him that to express that she was recognizing him for who he was. Yeah, so Sydney, I think that was kind of the thing about calling him son of David. That was what it was supposed to express, was that she was recognizing him in some way. I think the thing that I can't quite put two and two together on is why she would even know that language was important. Maybe she just had a lot of Jewish friends. I have no idea, but I'm interested by that. Amory says, if Jesus was fully human, he may have been affected by the cultural biases of his own group, but being fully God, he was able to turn it around. Carolyn says, I don't know, but I'm sure how I would feel. Oh, maybe it's I'm not sure. I don't know, but I'm not sure how I would feel if Jesus didn't intend to be fully inclusive in his ministry. Yeah. Mary, you're late, but I'm glad you're here. Mary says, I mean, Jesus is a person, but he's also the Son of God, so. Micah points out a comment on the Son of David. Mark doesn't include that particular title. Right, in Mark's version of the story, the woman doesn't call him Son of David. So I think this goes back to what Ellis was saying about this is written for a Jewish and early Christian audience, that might be put in there in Matthew. Jude says, free will is uber important to me, and I think Jesus changed his mind in this. Couldn't rely on the woman to not change her mind last second. Also, he's human, so mistakes happen. Yeah, so I'm getting sort of two things here. I'm getting sort of one group of folks that think Jesus is fully God and therefore would not, number one, make a mistake, and number two, would not allow this woman to go away unhealed, right? But that he would allow for testing, and he would allow for and he would allow for the biases of the people around him, right? So that's sort of one thing that I'm seeing. And the other side are the people that are saying, well, if Jesus is both fully God and fully human, then maybe this is just a moment where the human jumps out. That like Jesus, like I think this is, I know I'm playing with fire here. If you are somebody that are strict to the doctrine of Jesus being entirely sinless, right? Because you could say, well, if Jesus makes a mistake, that would be sin, and Jesus is sinless, so that can't happen, right? So if that's where you're coming from theologically, I totally respect that. But I think it's also an interesting way of reading it to think, like, if Jesus is also fully human, is it possible to make a mistake and not have sinned? You know what I mean? Like, is it possible that Jesus could still be entirely God and not sinned, but does make a mistake in his immediate snap judgments of somebody? So that's maybe a question that is hard to ask. Can Jesus make a mistake and still be sinless? I don't know, but I'm interested to think about that. Ellis says, I tend to agree with Julia's reading, but the Justin Tanis essay takes the other side, and he says some things I found worth holding for us as trans folks. Oh, Ellis, don't even worry about typing the quotes, because I'm going to read a section of this. Oh, you got one already. Well, I'm going to read a section of this in a second. Micah says, Amory, that makes me think of the concept of recapitulation. God in human form is able to rework human nature to bring it in line with God. Yeah, I love that. This idea of Jesus, I think recapitulation, what's the other word that I want for that? That's like a less theological word, but means the same thing. Oh, shoot, I can't remember the word for it. But it's essentially like if God is taking on human nature in Jesus, then God is also taking humanity and making it more godlike, right? That's what recapitulation is, but there's like a less theological word for it that I can't think of off the top of my head. But yeah, this idea that like in Jesus, because he's fully God and fully human, he takes the two things, then mixes them up and goes blah, 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 and like makes it all messy, right? And it's not as easy as saying this part's God and this part's human, because it's all mixed up in there, right? And then the Great Exchange, that's what I want. The Great Exchange, that's how it's talked about, where some humanity and some holiness, some godness get mixed up together so that humanity gets a little bit more godly, not godlike, but godly, through Jesus. And then also God gets a little more human through Jesus. So yeah, the Great Exchange or the recapitulation, I love that. Ellis is giving us a quote there, and I'm going to ignore it for a second because I'm going to read a bit. Mary says it could just be a misunderstanding. Could happen to anybody. Yeah, if this is a misunderstanding, then it's not necessarily even a mistake, and it's not necessarily a sin either, right? Yes. I'm just agreeing with what everybody says here. Bethany says, I mean, he did have a human brain. I make mistakes all the time with the things I'm fully knowledgeable and aware of. Right, in one of those moments where I can't imagine that Jesus, as a being with a brain, didn't have moments where he thought one thing and he was like, yes, this is the thing I'm going to say because I am God. And then his brain short circuits and he says something totally different. Anyways, okay, so thinking about all this, I want to read us a little section here because Ellis jumped us right into it. This is a section from a chapter that I believe that I wrote in the description of the video, but it's an essay called Eating the Crumbs That Fall from the Table, Trusting the Abundance of God. And it's by Justin Sabiatanis, who, it's just Justin Tanis here because he wasn't married at the time. But Justin Sabiatanis is a trans guy who has done an incredible amount of writing work and is a pretty amazing person. And he wrote this bit on this particular story, and I'm just going to read a tiny bit. One of the things that Tanis does in this chapter when he's looking at this is he looks at the three different major players that he sees in this story. And he sees Jesus, he sees the woman, and he sees the woman's daughter, who of course is not necessarily present, but is part of the story. And so he looks at each of those three characters in this particular essay, and he says, the woman's story is all about advocacy, right? It's advocacy for her daughter because she wants her daughter to be healed. And it's her standing up and not taking no for an answer, right? The second person is Jesus, and he talks about Jesus in the context of transformation, right? Jesus does tons of transformation in himself and in other people and in water and wine throughout the Gospels, right? So Jesus in transformation is where he looks at that second character. And then the third character, with the daughter, he looks at the concept of healing. And so he ties all those three things together by saying advocacy is necessary for transformation, and transformation should always be towards healing. If it's just transformation for transformation's sake, or advocacy for advocacy's sake, you burn out, right? It has to be towards something. It has to have a point. And so in this story, he thinks the point is healing, right? The healing of the daughter. I think you could argue for the point of this story also being wholeness, right? Not just healing, but wholeness. That Jesus is trying to bring two groups of people who don't know how to be together. And that's what eventually sort of Christian communities, early Christian communities become. So you could argue that it's a movement towards wholeness as well. So I'm going to read you just a tiny bit of this. And this is Justin Tanis's part of his argument for Jesus changing his mind. And I don't read this to tell you this is how you should understand the text. If you believe that Jesus knew what he was doing the entire time, I'm with you. But I think what Justin says about this is an interesting way to think about how we relate to God. So, in the course of this story, Jesus himself is transformed. How he is at the beginning of the story and how he acts at the end are quite different. Jesus' ability to make a radical shift in how he interacts with this woman speaks of the depth of his relationship with God, his sense of himself, and his own expansiveness of vision. It takes a person of enormous courage to change like this, to admit that he was wrong or to do things differently than he had done them even a moment before. A Messiah who is willing to be transformed is, for me, a Messiah worth following. A Messiah who changes is, for me, the Savior, because my life has been a story of changes. Mental and emotional, physical and spiritual. My life has certainly included its share of mistakes and shifts in thinking. A static Messiah would not provide a model of what to do when I'm faced with a change or a challenge. But this Jesus does show me what change can mean at its best. He was willing to admit a mistake and change his views and actions. This Jesus is far more powerful and far more appealing to me than a Jesus who somehow manipulated the situation to prove a point, not really thinking negatively about the woman at all. I find it frightening to think that Jesus might have simply played on the disciples' prejudices at her expense in order to make it more dramatic when he did show mercy. I don't believe Jesus acted this way. For the story to make sense, for the story to be reflective of the Jesus I see in the rest of Scripture, Christ must have changed through this encounter. So that's just Justin Tanis's sort of take on this. And I, as much as I don't know how I feel about the idea of maybe Jesus changing in certain ways or Jesus not knowing what he was doing in certain ways, I am really struck by what Tanis says about, like, if Jesus is entirely certain and sure every single moment of his life, how can I relate to that, right? Like, how can I, if we as disciples are supposed to learn how to act more like Jesus, more Christ-like, if we are held up to absolute perfection, I don't know. I don't know about you all, but I grew up in an evangelical system that did hold up perfection as the standard, and it didn't seem to be very healthy for anybody. And so for me, having a Jesus who is capable of change, or who can change, or can model that change, even if the modeling just means he knew what the disciples were going to say, and so he acted on that so that he could show what change looks like, that's good enough for me. But like seeing a Jesus who changes, whether it's for show or really, is important, I think, for me. So that's just my 2 cents. Justin says, I was raised to believe that Jesus didn't make mistakes, but I'm open to considering maybe he did sometimes. Yeah, Sydney and Julia say the same. Amory says, there are other instances in Scripture where God changes God's mind after encounters with humans. Totally true, and maybe we should do a whole Bible study on just like the points where God seems to change God's mind. Like, for instance, God wipes everybody off the face of the earth except for Noah and his family through the flood, and then God says God won't do that again. And like previously, God said God was sorry for making people, right? And that experiences some regret. And there's the story of Jonah, right? Where God's going to destroy the whole city, and then God changes God's mind, and Jonah's pissed about it. So there, also in those stories, you could argue God knew what was going to happen the whole time and was testing people or was putting people in situations to show a point. So that's definitely a possibility. But there are, whether or not what God intended behind the scenes isn't something we can see, right? And that's what's so hard about this. Micah says, a dynamic moving Messiah reminds me of the dynamic changing depiction of God found in Exodus. Moses pleads with God to spare Israel, and God relents. Totally. There are so many times. And remember when, so Moses pleads with God to spare Israel in Exodus, right? But even back in Genesis, Abraham pleads with God to not destroy, hold on. Why? Sodom and Gomorrah. There we go. Abraham pleads with God then, right? God's going to destroy the whole town, and Abraham's like, please don't. If there are just a couple people, will it be okay? So even in those moments, it seems like God is changing God's mind about what God will do because of these conversations with humans. Ellis says, I think also that the incarnation is a mystery. Christ's humanity and divinity together are not something we can force to make logical sense, and his ability to change is part of that mystery. Yeah, like I said, we just don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't have a backstage pass to what's actually happening here. Yeah. Oh, I like that Sydney's making that connection there and jumping off of what Micah said about a creator God who's open to debate and then a son who is able to change sometimes. Yeah, I like that connection there. So yeah, none of this is to tell anybody what you're supposed to believe about this text. I did a little bit of clickbait there with the title about changing Jesus' mind about inclusion because I wanted people to jump in on this conversation. So I'm not telling you that you have to believe that Jesus changed his mind. But the idea that this woman in conversation with Jesus opens up a whole new part of the story. What if the end of this story was just Jesus getting all the Jewish folks together? That would be pretty massive anyways. But what if that was the end of the story? This woman seems to help open up the story to the entire rest of the world through the people that were the hardest for Jesus's people to understand, right? And the hardest for them to get along with. And I think that's pretty interesting. Yeah, okay, so Amory just pointed out the wrestling with God bit. Yes, that was the early question I asked, the earliest question I asked about what does this story remind you of? There were also lots of notes in this story connecting it to God wrestling or Jacob wrestling with the angel or with God. That's what the Cyrophoenician, the Canaanite woman, is doing, is she's wrestling with Jesus verbally, right? Yeah, we're to the end of our time here almost, but I think one of the things that was interesting to me about the way that she wrestles, and I think even Justin talks about it in this essay, is that she takes what Jesus calls her and then makes it mean something different, which I think is really interesting. Okay, let me read you just this one other section here. In reading this story, I'm particularly struck by the woman's ability to take the slur that she heard and turn it into a metaphor that she uses to forward her cause. To be called a dog and then to argue that even dogs receive what they need from the master's table is remarkable. It takes a level head combined with a strong sense of self to pull this off. She kept herself so focused on the needs of her child that she did not waste time arguing with Jesus. She was not afraid to talk back to or to challenge Jesus. But she's also a reminder that proving someone's prejudices to be wrong is more effective than arguing about them. She does not allow herself to be baited. So I bring that last bit up because I think it reminds me of how lots of us have to deal with slurs and people calling us bad things. And to just hold this Canaanite woman in sort of, I don't know, I hold her in sort of amazement a little bit to think like she just got called something really bad, and without like the way that she responds to Jesus is a way that I don't know if I could respond in that moment. If somebody called me something terrible in that moment, I would respond with defensiveness or with aggression or with or I'd want to, try to prove that I wasn't that thing. And she doesn't do any of that. So it got me thinking a lot about reclamation of words in LGBTQ plus communities, because we do that a lot, where we take words that were used against us and we go, you know what? I'm not going to argue that I'm not that thing anymore. I'm just going to take that word and then move forward with the argument. So I thought that was kind of related to us as well. Ooh, yes. Okay, Micah's recommending Walter Brueggemann, who is amazing. Melissa says, it seems that Jesus' humanity allows him to identify with us. I'm not sure it was God's plan that Jesus' humanity is designed to allow us to identify with him. I think I have to think about that one a little more. I'm not sure it was God's plan that Jesus' humanity is designed to allow us to identify with him. Oh, I think I get what you're saying, Melissa. I'm going to have to think more about that. That is an interesting point. Jude says, yeah, connecting to the story of wrestling with the angel, probably being scarred by the way he responded. Yeah. Ella says, another thing this story reminds me of is Jesus' teaching about turning the other cheek, which has to do with asserting one's humanity non-violently, just as this woman does in this story. Yeah, I can see that connection. And Julia's requesting some prayer. For sure, Julia, we will put you on our prayer list. Yeah, we're always happy to do that. Thank you for sharing that with us. So that's where we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Thank you, everybody, for jumping into this story. It was a really fun one. It was a one with a lot of back and forth, and one that you all really jumped into with courage. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I know it can be hard in sort of events like this to express a view that maybe it seems like you're in the minority with, or that you have a minority view in some way. So I'm really proud of those of you that jumped in and said, actually, I think this. So thank you for doing that. It's really important that we talk about this stuff and not just all pretend that we agree, because we don't all agree, and that's okay. We can still be in community with each other. So thank you for sharing. With that, I think I'm going to wrap us up. As always, if you want to learn more about Transmission Ministry Collective and what we do there, you can go to our website, which is transmissionministry.com, and I'm going to put that in the chat right here, so you can find out more about what we do. If you are a trans or gender expansive person, we've got support groups and other stuff. We've got a Discord. We've got cool events going on. We also have, coming up in 2 weeks, we have an awesome workshop that Micah Melody, who's in the chat right now, is going to be facilitating for us. And presenting on deconstructing patriarchy, and it's going to be awesome. So if you want to know more about that, click over onto the website and on our calendar, and you'll see our events, all that coming up. So that's all, I think. Oh, good. Melissa's explaining this. Points are identifying more with Jesus when he is capable of changing his mind. Ah, yes. Okay. Thank you, Melissa, for explaining that. Now I get it. So that's everything, y'all, and I hope that you're having a good rest of your night. Thank you for being here, and we will catch you in 2 weeks for our next YouTube Bible study. Have a good night, everyone. Peace.